Okay, now that we've got all the technical matters taken care of, allow me to begin. And Grand Chief George Manuel wrote in his 1974 book, The Fourth World, an Indian Reality, this prediction: once the fourth world enters the historical consciousness of the globe, it arguably beacons the most dramatic history of the transcultural ever witnessed. My friend and colleague, Chief Manuel, changed the world's awareness. Changed the world awareness of reality that had been long subordinated in scholarship, diplomacy, and daily life, yet present as the cultural and epistemological foundation of all humanity. Fourth world peoples, Chief George Manuel affirmed, host many knowledge systems, many cultures, and many, many ways of organizing society, yet they share among them more than 5,000 distinct nations with a combined global population of 1.9 billion people, ancestral origins predating the 300-year-old state system, while remaining true to the principle of balance between nature and human need within territories they occupy. Fourth world peoples, however, are not recruited to their political situation on the basis of either ideology or economic well-being, or even their recently collected identity as indigenous peoples. Instead, they are peoples advancing intellectual and political movements temporarily united through space and time by their histories and traditions and the four directions. Thus, their place-based realities warrant a unique layer of analysis, the fourth world epistemologies. Among fourth world peoples, origin stories are central to all reality. For most peoples, origins define contemporary duties and responsibilities for each person in each generation. My ancestors are from many nations identified by their modern names as Cree, Oneida, Orcadians, and Swabians. As it is with my relatives, I am bound by my dudum, or my totem, or clan, as it is known in English. I am of the Bear dudum, Nuka in Cree, Okwali in Oneida. Nuka is the largest dudum of original peoples. Okwali individuals, as is true for other dudums, for example, are related to their dudum across tribes, nations, and countries through their relatives: wolf, bear, turtle, many kinds of birds, fish, deer, and antelopes, for example. As with all my relatives who are Okwali, the bear, I am responsible for ensuring governance and security and healing. I began these duties when I was very young, even before I was fully aware that I had Okwali relatives. One does not learn the responsibilities for one's dudum from books or classrooms. One learns from experience, reasoning, observation, dreams, and making comparisons, and then adding this knowledge to the great wealth of knowledge held by all members of the Okwali dudum. I tell you this not to express pride or some unique status, but to describe the basis for my knowledge as I address you today. Fourth world peoples draw on their Nindudameg, a metaphor, to be sure, for inspiration and connection to the beginnings. It was 20 years ago that I worked in virtual meetings with some 12 representative scholars and diplomats from as many fourth world nations. Our task was to prepare proposed language to be inserted into protocols for climate change a climate change treaty. Meeting of diplomats engaged in Bangkok, Thailand. These were negotiations to clarify the role of Indigenous knowledge in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. My colleagues and I discussed and negotiated and struggled with finding just the right words that would place the knowledge of Fourth World peoples at the heart of the Climate Change Convention. In the end, our recommendation that was ultimately accepted by those meeting in Bangkok simply stated that states parties shall recognize and respect Indigenous knowledge in the formulation of administrative, legislative, and judicial policies. I thought about our efforts for a short while after our submission, and then it hit me. How will the states and their policymakers recognize and respect traditional knowledge? How will they even know what traditional knowledge is when there could be literally hundreds of different knowledge systems, different traditional sciences practiced by different Fourth World peoples? How is that knowledge to be transmitted? How will the knowledge contained in the system be translated into a world committed to unrelenting development and consumption, practices that scholars and diplomats freely recognize as practices at the root of creating the adverse effects of climate change? This bothered me so much that I contacted some of my colleagues again and asked that we try to answer these questions, since if traditional knowledge comes in different forms, shouldn't we clearly indicate how these forms are expressed, how they align with or diverge from the prevailing systems of knowledge, based in unlimited progress and elimination of primitive? Some of my colleagues agreed with me, but others simply said, states will have to figure it out. I was unsatisfied by this conclusion. It seemed to me that we had only begun the conversation with the very states producing the global climate and ecological problems, and we failed to understand among ourselves, much less for the state diplomats, that there are many knowledge systems that have their own definitions and explanations of truth, their own epistemologies, their own discussion of the nature of knowledge, their own justifications, their own rationalities, and yes, their own methods. I had earlier published musings on the nature of knowledge and how different peoples in different ages express their knowledge in pursuit of their truth. I particularly considered knowledge from the perspective of my adopted Fourth World peoples, the Cowlitz tribe, within which I had learned cultural realities very different from the perspectives of the small townspeople that surrounded me as I was growing up. My mother was raised a Cree, with knowledge from the Deer clan, and my father was raised with Subian cultural knowledge, the Okwali or Bear clan. But as is the common practice of Fourth World peoples, in the absence of your family community, you associate with a nation that most usually closely matches your own while performing your duties. My father's Swabian family to this day is located in northern Switzerland and southwestern Germany. It had previously been part of all of Swabia, just across the border from Germany's Baden-Württemberg. The Swabians are sometimes referred to as Alemanni, or all the people, when this word is translated into English. Reflecting on my Bear Dudum through Cree, Oneida, Arcadian, and Swabian knowledge lenses, I began to deal with the question of many different knowledge systems. It became clear that the stories I had grown up hearing could only be depictions as images and ideas coming out of the shadows. This became even more clearly apparent to me as a young student in an American school system. I learned that there was a system of thinking that seemed absolute in its approaches to scientific truth, but it contrasted with the Bear experience that approaches to defining and stating scientific truth. Sometimes the different approaches arrived at the same truth, and at other times there were different truths. How could this be? Isn't truth by its nature the absolute conclusion of a scientific inquiry? They are different types of knowledge, and there are different types of knowledge, and these types of knowledge function differently when owned by an individual, a family, or a community, or within trans-community environments. The fourth world epistemological framework essentially states that the concepts of comparison, relational reasoning, balance between contending forces, and equality of kind, that human beings are part of all living things and not the dominant living thing, will, when applied in life and thought, ensure comity between peoples and living nature, and with the forces of the cosmos. Fourth world epistemology also asserts that human cultures, as with cultures of other animals, plants, rivers, mountains, and the lands, are defined by the evolving and dynamic relationship between people, the land, and the cosmos, existing in the past, present, and future simultaneously. History, memory, and thought processes are understood in time as simultaneous and multidimensional, where instead of two-dimensional thought, linear past progressing to the future, fatalistic or cyclical or providential, thought is in reality seven-dimensional and requiring the understanding of multi-level and multifactorial aspects of a problem. The seven-dimensional method for evaluating material and immaterial relationships as a truth in time can be aided by the four directions metaphor. The four directions metaphor is symbolically rendered as horizontal and vertical lines intersecting at their midpoints, demarcating space pointing to the planets polar north and south, and the rising sun and moon, and the tree of life, the stars making up the Milky Way galaxy. The vertical polar line is in dynamic motion, moving slowly back and forth, mirroring the Earth's wobble in space. The horizontal line not only points to the east and west, but it too moves up and down on axis, reflecting the seasons' changes, owing to the Earth's changing angle relative to the sun as it follows its orbit around the sun. The ancient cultures may symbolize the four directions, for example, as medicine wheels, a calendar, four direction symbols, and prayer ceremonies in the four directions toward the sun, the setting moon, and the polar north and south. As I suggested earlier, in the fourth world epistemological perspective essentially states that the concepts of comparison, relational reasoning, balance between contending forces, and equality of kind, that human beings are part of all the living things and not the dominant living thing, will be applied in life and thought, ensure comity between peoples and living nature and the forces of the cosmos. History, memory, and thought processes are multidimensional, where two-dimensional thought, linear passes progressing to the future, fatalistic, cyclical, or providential, are in reality seven-dimensional. Tracing thought diagrammatically, the process is more like a spiral, where motion and change moves in all directions simultaneously in space and time. Here, and we can change the screen to the next slide. Here we have important words and phrases to bear in mind as we discuss the fourth world epistemologies. Blended knowledge, cosmogram, culture, four directions, knowledge system, metaphor, and science. And I draw attention to the word science in part to clarify for most of us who've gone through the academic institutions that science is not singular, but it really is sciences. There are many sciences in the different systems of knowledge. Now, switch to the next screen. You'll see here in the Congo 4 directions, symbolically rendered as horizontal and vertical lines intersecting at their midpoints. Let me see, do we have that? Yes. Now let's go back up. You have to go higher, back up to the Congo. Up. Okay, there you go. Thank you. It demarcates space, pointing to the planets polar north and south, rising sun and moon, and the tree of life, just as we noted earlier. The horizontal line not only points to the east and west, but it too moves up and down on its axis, reflecting the seasonal changes owing to the Earth's changing angle relative to the sun as it follows its orbit around the sun. Ancient cultures symbolize the 4 directions, for example, as a medicine wheel, calendar, 4 distinct symbols, and prayer ceremonies, as I indicated earlier. The 4 directions dynamic symbol not only operates on a single 2-dimensional plane, as I've indicated, but I want to emphasize that it is on a multi-dimensional level. Switch to the next screen, please. Anawak in the Mexica language describes the place surrounded by water, used to designate the knowledge system in Fourth World America on which all other Western Hemispheric systems of knowledge appear to be based. It is apparent that many Fourth World knowledge systems around the globe are constructed similarly, suggesting extensive cross-cultural sharing and influence both within and between hemispheres. It is evident that the Anawak knowledge system originated among the Toltec of Tolan, the cradle culture of scholars and seers in Mexico, reaching back more than 1,800 years. They have influenced the Anishinaabe, the Quechua, the Mapuche, the Dene, many other nations around and across the Western Hemisphere. Central to this knowledge system is the concept of la'ech. That's L-A-E-C-H. It is the principle of love and respect for one's fellow human being. It humanizes humankind by eliminating the ego. It unites as opposed to disuniting. It humanizes as opposed to dehumanizing and fragmentation. It is the ultimate principle of spiritual love. A second concept is Panchebe. That's P-A-N-C-H-E-B-E, or to seek the root of the truth and justice. This third concept is Hunab Ku, one supreme maker of all things, or the dynamic energy of the cosmos and the unity and totality of all things. So you see in this diagram, I believe we have on the screen, yes, different colors, different directions certainly, but all of these directions contain information about plants, animals, land locations, and cosmological locations, which inform the scholars how best to approach these sources of life and how to promote their use. So this is a guide to living among, in this case, the Purepecha and their agrocosmology. But it, of course, could apply to not only plants and animals, but it can have to do with how you construct buildings. It can have to do with how you build roads and even where you build roads. Go ahead and change to the next. Here we have the Mayan calendar, which is the 4 directions cosmogram. And what is remarkable about this particular cosmogram is that it was used to calculate the number of years it would take for the Earth and solar system to circumnavigate all around the galaxy, which turned out to be 25,000 years. This was conceived 2,500 years ago with the great circle symbol of the Mayan calendar. And when they were able to use this calendar, it could be used for cosmological information, but it could also deal with the intimate personal relation, because it had to do with also how you define people's names as they were born. So this symbol of 4 directions, which is a far more complex version, tended to show those scholars of the day, they happened to be among them the Toltecs, the best approaches to understanding the cosmos, the land, and the people. Now, the other symbol that you see on the screen is really a depiction of health devices. But it's among the Anishinaabe, who are in Canada, and it expresses, the narrative explains the particular relationships between constantly evolving living reality and all of the elements within that living reality. You'll notice that the diagram indicates the status of people, elders, children, youth, parents. You will notice that it also identifies the dudums, in this case, the bear, could be the eagle, the wolf, and the buffalo. And it also deals with the seasons, winter, spring, summer, and autumn. And finally, it deals with such issues as wind, fire, and earth, and water. All of these end up being directly influential in the practice of medicine among the Anishinaabe. It is called, therefore, the Anishinaabe medicine wheel. The next screen shows us the Wanga 4 direction symbol. In the continent of Africa is a home to generations of peoples carrying the genetic markers of human beings extending back more than 2 million years. In the Center for World Indigenous Studies, where we did a Fourth World Atlas project, we estimated there were more than 1,000 distinct nations located in 54 African states. There were that many different perspectives on the knowledge systems. But this one, the Wanga, is of particular importance because it emphasizes the vital force and the various forms of relationships between all things, and it confirms those relationships. The knowledge of the force is confirmed by Kijimba. However, there are 2 kinds of knowledge: absolute and immutable knowledge, and relative and speculative knowledge. Africa's Fourth World peoples store, retrieve, and communicate knowledge orally, embedded in slogans, ceremonial or spiritually driven languages, poetry, leadership, lists of reigning monarchs, and narratives or tales and commentaries. The 4 directions defined in the image of the Congo cross incorporates a direct red pyramid pointing to the north toward the Sahara Desert, and black pyramid pointing to the south toward the southern part of African continent. And colored circles contain deep meaning connecting the people, the land, and the cosmos. So you see, we have in these different symbols all the basis for the four directions, but different applications within various knowledge systems, but nevertheless approaching the same outcomes, and that is providing a metaphor that ensures the ability to recite the knowledge within the knowledge system. The usages may take the form of historical and artistic and personal, non-legal commentaries, but in all of this, we see that the relationships are essential to the mode of thought. Education is achieved through peer or communitarian learning, only guided in limited ways by an instructor. The vital force can ebb and flow depending on circumstances, but remains ever present as evidence of life. Now, the four directions briefly discussed here share several commonalities. The intimate relationship between the personal and impersonal, comprehension of universal life forces, the unity of all things, physical and metaphysical, the four directions metaphor, and the origins of all things, ultimately centering on the founding of land on water, an island or a place where all life begins. By comparing the four directions, we see that each springs from local, that is individual, family, and community conceptions, and that the local radiates to trans-local environments to continental systems. There has for centuries been sharing between cultures. And these cross-cultural conversations have built a continental-wide systems of knowledge while energizing the evolution of individual, family, and community, as well as sub-regional knowledge, while energizing the evolution of these various systems. While observers and scholars generally refer to indigenous knowledge as localized, limited, and functional, the reality is that all knowledge systems function in dynamic human cultural environments where exchange and sharing is not only practiced, but also necessary to achieve continuity. Cross-cultural fertilization of ideas and experiences is a normal dynamic for any successful culture, and it is notable that the expression of knowledge will have localized attributes, but such knowledge sits within a broader knowledge paradigm. In China, the Han and virtually all of the other nationalities have embedded the four directions metaphor in their cultural reality. All of the cultures assign colors, qualities, plants, animals, and cosmology, and human aspects to the four directions. And it is worth noting that that occurs in China, among the Ainu in Japan, among Arabic populations and Slavic peoples as well. Here are some of the key elements of the epistemological framework: relational reasoning and expressions of narrative analysis. Indigenous evaluation is relational and multidimensional. Storytelling is used as a means by which you transmit the knowledge. Story imposes, eliminates, and controls time and space so that the mind, the spirit, can learn, explore, remember, alter, expand, and contract ideas, experiences, and perceptions. Dreaming mediates and is a waiting for a method that is dreaming, meditation, and waiting are are all performed as methods similar to storytelling, in that these methods of obtaining information and understanding bridge the gap between the material and the immaterial reality. Stressing is something that most people will not necessarily regard as a key element of knowledge production. But stressing is, as it turns out, an important activity because stressing increases natural body hormones that promote the body to act in an urgent situation, or what is commonly called the fight and or flight. The result can be turned to the process of discovering new knowledge. Narrative analysis and portraiture and metaphor are all devices and tools for helping to combine the material to the immaterial and providing us with a broader perspective so that we can inspect them all. Comparing is the tool by which we actually can take objects, concepts and observations, and then rationally explore similarities and dissimilarities. Retrodiction, which is one of my favorite tools in Fourth World epistemology, is to be able to systematically step back in time, considering, comparing, or establishing relations between pairs or multiples of factors, objects, ideas, events, stories, arts, and other manifestations of physical or metaphysical manifestations to establish or predict what may happen in the future, define what is occurring in the present, or explain the meaning of an event that is actually occurring in the past. In other words, retrodiction provides a tool. Excuse me. A retrodiction provides a tool for glomming onto past events and connecting them to the present and to the future. Remembering is probably the most common device, and that is simply using what the brain does naturally. It connects symbols and concepts to images in our thoughts, such that we can then grasp those concepts and then share those concepts in other forms. Time, space, and place animate the great consciousness which fills the universe. At different periods in the brief history of human beings, at least 5 different but related modes of thought lead to knowing and ultimate expression of consciousness. We just looked at some tools. Now what I want to do is look at the different knowledge systems that actually exist in our present day, and I've given 5 examples. Next slide. If you would, please. We should be losing, there we go. Here we have 5 different ways of expressing knowledge. And many who have gone to the current academic institutions will recognize immediately the concept of progressivism. Progressivism is one concept that says the past, or there are backward conditions that we want to improve and we want to excel to the perfect. And I symbolize that with a single line that runs from the lower left to the upper right, projecting upward. Progressivism presupposes that there is an excellent condition to which we all strive, but we must eliminate the backward and the primitive. Providentialism is a concept that says there is an inevitability about how life will be lived, because everything is essentially preconditioned according to God's will. And we therefore must accept how circumstances exist now. So if we're a slave, for example, we must accept being a slave because that is what God predetermined. If, however, we're rather wealthy and well-positioned, we must accept that as our fate because, again, God predetermined that. All of our thinking, therefore, is predicated on a knowledge of a predestination. Cyclicism is yet another concept that the Greeks practiced, and that was based on an understanding that the sun rose in the east and it set in the west. And so therefore, one day could be replicated or repeated on the basis of what happened on the previous day, simply because it appears that everything is repeated in a cyclical fashion. And the Greeks were able to function reasonably well with this conception of knowledge. Fatalism is yet another version of really the providentialism and cyclicism, but it is practiced primarily by the Nubians, by the Confucians in China, and that is, there is an absolute certainty that the outcomes in life will always be defined, and you can't do a thing about them. So you live according to the fatalistic outcome. That influences how you think about everything. That influences how all of your life is organized. Then there is spiralism, and that's my introduction from the perspective of basically the Mayan experience or the Western hemispheric idea. That actually is practiced in every continent among the world's fourth world peoples. And that is, life is in constant motion, moving in all directions simultaneously, forward and back, to the side and up and down at the same time. And that circumstances because they're in motion, require our recognition that change is something to which we respond. It is not necessarily something we cause. We recognize it, and it influences how we measure things, and therefore time is essential to the whole concept of spiralism. We're running a little shy of time here, so I'm going to proceed a little ways down the road. Go to the next slide, please. I have offered you another version of spiralism. You'll see on the left the Hanapku, which is a symbol used among the Mexica and Maya to characterize the great cycle of life. This has been defined as a 5,125-year cycle, as evidenced by the mode found in fundamental Middle America and South American cultures. You'll notice that it also has a characteristic similar to the four directions. And what it represents is lightness and darkness, as well as all of the features of life, as well as our conceptions of reality. You'll see onto the right what is in fact a grub. And I introduced the grub because my concept or understanding of the grub came from an experience I had in Australia with my Aboriginal friends there, who introduced me to the coconut grub. They pulled out from underneath the roots of a coconut tree. And we were talking about the infinite spiral of knowledge. And they turned to me and said, yes, that's like the grub. If you look carefully, you'll see that it has little round ribs, and it goes to a sharp point at one end, and it starts at a sharp point on the other end. And it is forever moving in one direction as well as other directions, up, down, and to the sides as well. And so for me, it became a perfectly wonderful symbol of spiralism, and that is the coconut grub from Australia. Let me just say, it is on the basis of these understandings that fourth world epistemology has come to assert that comparison, relational reasoning, balance between contending forces, and equality of kind will assure comity between peoples living nature, and with the forces of the cosmos. Human culture, as with cultures of other animals, plants, rivers, mountains, and the lands that form the structure, life, and living, is defined by the evolving and dynamic relationship between people, the land, and the cosmos. History, memory, and thought processes are multidimensional, where instead of two-dimensional concepts, such as those we've indicated earlier, that is, thought is in reality 7 or more dimensions, and successful comprehension of reality demands employing all 7 dimensions. While many scholars may suggest this demonstrates a kind of holism, the truth is that this conceptual framework is much more expansive than holistic thought, making it possible to conceive of the miniature as well as the universal simultaneously in a systematic fashion. Time and space are reduced to the now, such that the past, present, and future, and the here and there are all one and not truly separate. Fourth world epistemology offers a conceptual framework that embraces the intuitive and the rational, or perhaps more specifically, a blend of rational reductionism and inductionism. This blending of method may permit the application of traditional knowledge to understand relationships of elements within an environment of chaos, as well as logical and mythological problems. Researchers are encouraged by fourth world epistemology and epistemological frameworks to conduct inquiries that are multidimensional, to present and explain complex problems in ways manageable at the human scale. That is the subject of knowledge systems, and that's the whole purpose of knowledge systems, to explore realms not immediately accessible, but to interpret and make understandable those domains and compound domains that define the physical and metaphysical realities, the material and the immaterial. Thank you so much.